Jack Whitmore, a U.S. Army veteran seeking peace, thought he had simply rescued a half-dead German shepherd from the snow. But after Rex recovered, the dog began acting strangely. Every day, he stood rigid at the window, staring deep into the Colorado forest, whining with a haunting urgency. He wasn't lost in the past. He was trying to lead Jack somewhere. Trusting the only companion he had left, Jack followed Rex through the moonlit woods for hours, until they reached a forgotten cabin. The door was chained shut from the outside, yet smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was inside. What secret was buried in that isolated prison? Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The moon hung low over the Colorado wilderness, a silver disk suspended in a sky brushed with thin, sweeping clouds. The night air was crisp but not cruel, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and the faint dampness of melting snow clinging to the underbrush. The forest stretched in all directions like a cathedral of shadows and silence, lit only by moonlight filtering through bare branches. Somewhere between solitude and isolation, a man stood still, his breath misting in the cold air, his eyes locked on the trail ahead. Jack Whitmore adjusted the weight of his pack and let his gaze drift through the undergrowth. The trail was faint now, more suggestion than path, swallowed slowly by creeping ferns and moss-covered rocks. At 6'1" with a strong, angular frame hardened by a decade of military service, Jack moved like a man who still measured the world in tactical distances. His dark brown hair was cut close to the scalp, already peppered with gray at the temples, and a short beard lined his jaw. Practical, unkempt, not decorative. Lines tugged at the corners of his eyes, not from age but from strain, and he wore silence like armor. He had come to these woods 2 months ago, fleeing the clamor of a Denver he no longer recognized and memories he couldn't outrun. War had taken things from him, some visible, like the scar that ran from his shoulder to his forearm, and some hidden, like the weight in his chest that no VA prescription ever touched. His plan had been simple: disappear, stay quiet. Let the cold silence of the forest do what time and therapy could not. But silence was a brittle kind of medicine. At Jack's side padded a German shepherd, his thick coat blending with the shadows, only his amber eyes catching glints of moonlight. The dog moved with precision and purpose, his ears perked and head held low, every muscle taut as if pulling on some invisible thread. Jack had found him 3 weeks earlier, collapsed on the edge of an old service road after a violent blizzard. The dog had been half dead, bleeding from his flank and tangled in broken cord. Jack had carried him back to the cabin without hesitation, working by firelight and instinct, using the same battlefield triage he once relied on in places he tried not to think about. He hadn't intended to name the dog, but the name had come anyway. Rex, uttered softly one night when the shepherd laid his head across Jack's boots like he'd always belonged there. Since then, they'd grown into a quiet rhythm. Rex watched Jack with a calm, vigilant loyalty, but lately something had shifted. The dog would often sit by the cabin's window, unmoving for hours, staring into the trees like a soldier on watch. Then, tonight, he had begun pacing, first to the door, then to Jack, then back again, whining low in his throat like something inside him was clawing its way out. Jack had resisted at first, but the moment he looked into those eyes, focused, pleading, full of some desperate knowledge, he grabbed his gear and followed. Now, in the dense hush of the forest, Rex slowed, his nose tilted skyward. Then he moved again, more quickly this time, leading Jack through a narrow corridor of brambles and vine-covered trunks until they emerged into a small clearing choked in shadow. There, tucked beneath the cover of twisted oaks and heavy ivy, stood a cabin. Jack stopped cold. It looked like it had been forgotten by time. Its roof sagged beneath a thick veil of moss, and creeping vines ran along its weather-beaten proportions like veins on ancient hands. The front steps were cracked, barely clinging to the frame. Yet from the crooked chimney, a thin, unmistakable wisp of smoke rose into the cold night. Jack's eyes narrowed. His hand instinctively dropped to the sidearm at his hip. A cabin that looked abandoned, but wasn't. That was a contradiction. And contradictions got people killed. He stepped forward slowly, scanning the windows, none of which emitted light. No movement, no sound. Rex growled low, his posture shifting. He wasn't afraid, but alert, bristling with recognition. Jack crouched behind a tree and watched, his military instincts flaring like old scars in the cold. Everything in him said this place didn't feel right. The smoke meant someone was inside, and the neglect outside didn't match. It wasn't the kind of cabin someone passed through. It was the kind you used when you didn't want to be found. He looked at Rex. The dog's ears were pinned forward. His breathing had slowed. His focus was absolute. Something, or someone, was inside that cabin. And judging by the way Rex had dragged him here across 5 miles of forest, it wasn't a coincidence. Jack stepped out from the trees and slowly approached the front of the house. Each footfall was deliberate, every creak of the ground beneath him noted and registered. The door was heavy wood, swollen from years of weather, but what drew his attention was the thick iron chain wrapped across the front handles, locked tight with an old brass padlock. He reached out and touched the metal. It was cold, but the chain hadn't been there long. Some of the ivy around the doorway had been cut clean, not grown over it. Jack turned slowly, his breath shallow. He scanned the clearing again. Still no signs of life. Still no noise. But the chimney told a different story. Someone had been inside recently. Maybe still was. Rex whimpered and took a step forward, placing a paw on the bottom step. His gaze was fixed on the door, not with fear, but with purpose. Like this place meant something. Like this was why he had survived that storm, why he had come to Jack in the first place. Jack's mind ran through the possibilities. Squatter, fugitive, someone injured. But something deeper was whispering beneath his logic. A thread of memory. A feeling he couldn't name. He stepped back and looked up at the moon, hanging like an old eye over the cabin. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out his multi-tool, and bent over the lock. He had followed Rex this far, and something told him he was right to. The cold bit deeper the closer Jack got to the cabin. The night had fallen into a kind of breathless stillness, as if the forest itself was holding back, watching. The clearing was wrapped in shadow, the trees tall and unmoving under the silver sheen of the moon. Jack's boots made little sound against the frost-hardened ground as he stepped onto the porch. The cabin's door was bound shut, not jammed, but deliberately secured. A rusted iron chain wrapped tightly around both handles, sealed with a brass padlock that had weathered many seasons, but not time. Ivy had been cleared from the doorway recently, exposing splintered wood and signs of force. Someone had locked this place on purpose, and not long ago. Rex stood stiff at Jack's side, nose quivering, hackles raised. The dog let out a sharp, guttural growl and clawed at the base of the door with urgent force. His body pulled toward it as though by invisible thread. His breathing was fast, focused. Jack had never seen him like this. Jack dropped his bag onto the porch and crouched beside the door, studying the lock. He knew the type. Simple, stubborn, and made to deter rather than defend. With a quiet grunt, he reached for the steel pry bar tucked inside his gear. The tool bit into the rusted chain with a screech. It took 3 hard thrusts before the padlock gave way, falling to the wooden planks with a dull thud. The chain rattled to the ground after it. The moment the last link dropped, Rex surged forward, pawing the now free door. Jack opened it slowly. A burst of stale, musty air met him, thick with the smell of damp rot, old smoke, and something fainter beneath it. Something human. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom inside. The cabin's front room was small and disordered. A broken armchair, a rust-stained stove, walls of peeling pine paneling. It looked abandoned. But the smoke he'd seen was real. Someone had been here recently. Maybe still was. Rex didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, weaving through debris, nose low, body taut. Jack followed with quiet steps, scanning every shadow. The flashlight revealed a battered table, a coat tossed over a chair, and discarded food tins. All pointed to survival, not comfort. Then came the sound, faint, like a whisper cracking through brittle leaves. A soft voice. Jack turned his head sharply. Rex was already halfway through the back door, nudging it open with his snout. Jack raised the flashlight, moving carefully. The second room was dimmer, smaller. A single bed sat against the far wall, its metal frame rusted, thin mattress bent beneath the weight of a small, frail figure. The woman lay on her side, unmoving, bundled beneath layers of threadbare blankets. One wrist was bound to the bed frame with a metal cuff. The skin beneath it was raw, bruised purple and red. Her other hand rested on her chest like a forgotten gesture. She was elderly, perhaps in her 70s, her body thin almost to transparency, bones sharp beneath paper-thin skin. Long gray hair clung to her temples in damp strands. Her lips were cracked. Her face, though gaunt, held remnants of beauty that age and suffering hadn't erased. High cheekbones, a narrow nose, and a jaw that once knew strength. Rex stepped closer, slow and cautious. Then he whined, a soft, broken sound Jack had never heard from him before. The woman stirred. Her fingers moved slightly. Her eyes opened. They were pale blue, dulled by exhaustion, but filled with something else. Recognition. Her dry lips parted. Rex? The name trembled from her throat like the last embers of a fire. The German shepherd moved forward without waiting for permission and rested his head against the side of the bed. The woman's hand lifted, barely, and touched his ear. "I knew you'd find me," she whispered. Jack stood motionless. The room suddenly felt narrower. He could feel his pulse in his neck. This wasn't coincidence. He approached the bed slowly, kneeling beside Rex. The woman's eyes drifted toward him now, glassy but alert. They scanned his face as if searching for confirmation, then returned to Rex. "You brought him," she murmured, almost inaudible. Jack swallowed hard, trying to steady the rush in his chest. "You know this dog?" She nodded, barely. "My dog. My brave boy." And then it clicked. All the strange behavior. Rex pacing by the windows, staring into the forest for days. The direction he insisted on. The relentless urgency in his movements. Jack hadn't been wandering into someone else's story. Rex had found him for a reason. He hadn't been looking for refuge. He'd been looking for a rescuer. Jack reached for the cuff on the bedpost. His fingers shook, not from cold, but from realization. This was no longer just a rescue. This was a reunion. The storm outside had grown thicker, wrapping the cabin in a muffled white silence. Snow coated the windows like frostbitten lace, and the wind scratched along the wooden walls with fingers made of ice. Inside, the fire in the stove hissed and cracked, sending up erratic shadows that danced across the cluttered floorboards. Jack moved quietly through the room, trying not to disturb the stillness that had settled after Sarah had fallen asleep. He had laid her on the worn couch near the fire, bundled in the emergency thermal blanket, and placed a folded flannel shirt beneath her head for support. Her breathing had evened out into a faint rhythm, shallow but steady. Rex lay curled tightly at the base of the couch, his large body pressed against the leg of the furniture, ears flicking at every sound Sarah made. He didn't sleep. He didn't blink. He was guarding her. Jack stood with arms crossed, staring at the half-burned log in the stove, his thoughts heavy. That voice, her cracked whisper of Rex's name, still echoed in his ears. It hadn't been confusion. It had been recognition. And everything about the way Rex had moved, the way he leaned into her without hesitation. It was clear now. This dog had once belonged to her. Jack turned from the fire and began quietly searching the cabin. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Supplies, answers, signs of who had done this to her. The shelves were mostly empty, but on the small table pushed against the far wall, he spotted a pile of old cloth and a ceramic mug, dust-coated but recently used. Beneath the mug, something hard caught his eye. A small, leather-bound journal with a cracked spine and buckled corners. He picked it up and thumbed through the first few pages. The name on the inside cover was written in delicate cursive, Sarah Elizabeth Carter. The first entry was dated nearly a year ago, April 2nd. It's quiet here, but it's mine. Dylan says I should sell the place, but I won't. Not now. Not ever. Jack's brows furrowed. He turned the page. June 18th he came again. Stayed longer this time. Kept asking about the land deeds. I told him I didn't know where they were. That was a lie, of course. I hid them. I think he suspects. July 7th, something has changed in him. The way he looks at me. It's not family anymore. It's calculation. The entries grew darker, shorter, more frantic as the months went on. The neat handwriting began to tremble. August 12th, he brought Rex with him today. Said he found him wandering the road. Rex barked at him, growled. He kicked him hard. I screamed. He smiled. Jack's stomach turned. August 17th. Dylan locked the door from the outside. I begged him. He said I was too stubborn to see reason. That if I signed over the land, I could leave. I won't. I won't let him win. August 21st. He hurt Rex. Said the dog was too loyal. He left him in the snow, said, "Let the mutt find his own grave." Jack exhaled slowly, his hand tightening on the brittle paper. Rex had survived that. Wounded, freezing, left for dead, and he hadn't run away. He had found Jack. He had led him back here. back to her. Jack gently closed the journal, placed it back where he found it, and walked toward the couch. Sarah stirred slightly at the sound of his boots on the creaky floorboards. Her head shifted just enough to see him through half-lidded eyes. "You found it?" she whispered. "I did," Jack replied softly, kneeling beside her. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy." She shook her head a fraction. "You needed to know." He hesitated before asking, "Who is Dylan to you?" She blinked slowly. "My nephew. My sister's boy. She died when he was young. I raised him when I could, but he always had a hunger for more than what was his. He found out about the land value, some report about minerals or oil. He wanted it, but the deed, it's hidden. He couldn't get it unless I gave it willingly." Jack nodded, anger rising in his chest. "So, he locked you up, hurt Rex, left you to die." A weak smile flickered across her face. "But Rex didn't die. He found you." Jack looked toward the dog, who hadn't moved since the moment he'd settled near her. "No, he didn't." Sarah's breath caught slightly, and Jack could see a faint tremble in her lips. "He's always been loyal." He never gave up. Jack reached for his field pack and began unpacking what little he had left. Gauze, antiseptic, water purification tablets, a small metal cup. He warmed some snowmelt over the stove and returned to her side. "Let me check that wrist again," he said. She nodded faintly, her eyes drifting closed. Jack carefully peeled back the blanket and lifted her wrist into his hand. The skin was cracked and discolored. He cleaned it gently, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped it tightly with clean gauze. Her fingers twitched slightly at the sting, but made no sound. When he finished, he checked her temperature. Cool, but no longer dangerously so. Her pulse was weak but steady. He pressed 2 fingers lightly to her neck, counting silently. "She'll make it," he murmured to himself. He adjusted the blanket and sat back on his heels, stretching his sore shoulders. The room fell quiet again, save for the soft breathing of the woman and the steady rhythm of Rex's breath, deep, loyal, constant. The fire popped once, casting a glow across the dog's face. His eyes were open, watching Jack, and then turned back to Sarah. Rex wouldn't leave her, and neither would Jack. The snow had stopped falling by the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, but a new kind of stillness settled over the forest, thicker, heavier. Jack felt it in his spine as he stood by the window, watching the treetops sway in the cold evening wind. Something in the air had shifted. The storm outside had passed, but a different kind was building in his gut. The same kind of tension he used to feel before an ambush. Behind him, Sarah rested uneasily on the couch, her frame still frail beneath the blanket, her thin fingers loosely curled around a half-full cup of warm broth. She hadn't spoken in over an hour. Her eyes had closed, but her breathing remained steady. Jack didn't disturb her. Instead, he moved through the cabin in slow, quiet patterns, checking the fire, organizing his gear, cleaning the knife he'd used to cut more cloth for bandages. Rex remained close to Sarah, ears twitching at the smallest creaks in the floorboards. The dog was alert, head resting on his paws, but muscles tense beneath his sable coat. Jack trusted Rex's instincts more than his own, and when Rex lifted his head and stared at the door with his entire body going rigid, Jack knew something was wrong. A sound came next, the soft crunch of boots over icy snow. Jack stepped back from the window and moved to the wall, placing himself at an angle beside the door. He reached for his rifle, propped silently against the old bookshelf. Rex stood slowly, no bark, just a low rumble vibrating from his chest like distant thunder. The door handle turned. Then it stopped. Another pause. Another crunch of snow. The door opened. The cold swept in like a slap of wind, and with it, a man. Dylan Carter stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the moonlight, snowflakes clinging to the shoulders of his expensive wool coat. He was in his early 30s, but the years had etched tension into his face prematurely. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, though disheveled now, and a 5 o'clock shadow coated his jaw like a lazy afterthought. His eyes were sharp, darting across the room with practiced calculation, the kind of gaze used to sizing people up, not seeing them. He stepped inside without seeing Jack. "Rise and shine, Auntie," Dylan called out, his voice low, casual, with a bitter undertone of mockery. "Brought you some more gourmet cuisine." He dropped a canvas duffel bag onto the floor with a dull thud. Then he looked toward the couch and stopped. Jack stepped out from the shadows, rifle in hand, aimed but not yet raised. "Put your hands where I can see them." Dylan flinched, his hand twitching toward his waist. His eyes widened when he saw Rex standing beside the couch, teeth bared in a silent snarl. "You," Dylan stammered. "You were dead. I left you to—" "That was your mistake," Jack said coldly. "Who the hell are you?" Dylan barked, trying to steady his voice. His posture stiffened, but it was clear. He wasn't a fighter. He was a manipulator. A man who used words and pressure, not fists. And now he was cornered. "I'm the man your dog brought here to fix what you broke." Dylan's eyes flicked to the rifle, then to Rex, then to Sarah, still half-conscious, but now awake, her eyes open and locked on him. Something in her gaze made him hesitate. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, stepping backward. But Rex stepped forward, and the moment cracked. Dylan lunged. Jack raised the rifle just in time to deflect Dylan's arm as it swung wildly toward him. The gun clattered to the floor. They grappled, Jack's instincts firing faster than thought. Dylan was desperate, reckless, all thrashing limbs and clenched fists. Jack moved with precision, block, counter, shift his weight, until he slammed Dylan hard into the wall. Rex barked sharply, a single explosive warning. The tension broke with the sound of glass shattering. The old kerosene lantern on the table had tipped in the scuffle. It fell, cracked, and burst into flame as the oil spread across the dry wooden floor. The fire caught fast, licking up the legs of the table, rolling over the wall like spilled lightning. Smoke bloomed upward. In seconds, the cabin filled with the scent of burning cloth, pine, and old varnish. Jack shoved Dylan to the floor and kicked the duffel bag aside. "Stay down!" Rex was already at Sarah's side, barking and nudging her. Jack ran to her and lifted her with both arms. She weighed barely more than the blankets around her. The heat was rising rapidly, the walls groaning as smoke turned orange with firelight. The cabin, the vines, the logs, the history, it was going to burn. Jack dashed for the door with Sarah in his arms, Rex bounding beside them. Behind him, Dylan scrambled, coughing, stumbling after them into the frozen night. Outside, the air was blistering cold, a shock after the heat inside. Jack rushed to the edge of the clearing and laid Sarah down on the snow-covered ground, removing his coat and placing it under her. Rex stood over her protectively, tail stiff, eyes locked on the doorway. Behind them, The cabin had become a furnace. Flames roared through the roof, chewing through timbers, casting embers into the wind like dying stars. The glow lit the forest in a hellish flicker. Then came sirens. 2 snowmobiles burst into the clearing from the northern trail, headlights cutting through smoke. The first rider was a tall man in a tan sheriff's coat, his silver badge glinting on his chest. Sheriff Thomas Miller, tall, broad-shouldered, in his late 50s with deep lines etched around his eyes, swung off the vehicle and surveyed the scene in seconds. "What's the situation?" he asked, voice calm but firm. Jack stood, rifle still slung behind his back. "The woman's Sarah Carter. She was held here. That man," he nodded toward Dylan, who had collapsed near the porch, covered in ash and coughing, "is responsible." The sheriff looked at Rex, then at Sarah, then at the Inferno. "Deputy, cuff him." The younger deputy moved quickly, pulling Dylan to his feet and locking his wrists behind his back. As flames consumed the last of the cabin, Sheriff Miller stood beside Jack and said quietly, "You saved her life." "No," Jack replied, glancing at Rex. He did. Morning light broke gently over the Colorado Rockies, brushing the snowy peaks with the soft gold of a world ready to begin again. It had been 2 weeks since the fire, since Dylan Carter was led away in cuffs and the cabin he tried to bury his sins in was reduced to ash and smoke. The forest, indifferent as ever, had begun to reclaim the clearing with its slow, quiet wisdom. And yet, something new had taken root. Hope, not just in the land, but in the people who returned to it. Sarah Carter had been airlifted to Denver General that night, her pulse barely strong enough to register. The chopper blades stirred the treetops as Rex watched from below, his ears high, tail still. Jack had ridden beside her, one hand wrapped gently around her thin, age-spotted fingers, the other steady on the strap of his old rucksack. Now she was awake, and more than that, alive. Sarah was a tall, slender woman in her early 70s, with a posture that still held echoes of the dancer she'd once been. Her silver hair was wispy and long, braided loosely behind her head. The lines on her pale skin were deep but graceful, carved by time and sorrow, more than joy. But there was strength in her eyes, a gray that seemed to remember everything and forgive almost as much. The room at Denver General was quiet save for the slow beeping of monitors and the rustle of pages turning. Jack sat beside her, flipping through a manila envelope left by the hospital's legal liaison. His hands, calloused and steady, paused when Sarah touched his arm gently. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said, her voice faint but warm. Jack looked up, brow furrowed. "I suppose not," she smiled softly. "It was before you were born." Long before he waited. "I was engaged once," she began, her gaze drifting toward the hospital window. "To a man named Henry Whitmore, your grandfather. We were young, stubborn, and full of plans. But war has a way of cutting threads before they tie." Jack blinked, stunned. "You were—" "He left for Korea," she nodded, "and never came back. At least not to me. I waited. I wrote. But letters stopped coming. I thought he'd forgotten me or—" her voice caught, "or that he'd fallen for someone else. Years later, I found out he'd been wounded, lost part of his memory for a time, then thought I had moved on. We never reconnected." Jack leaned forward, the pieces of a puzzle falling into place he never knew existed. "So, That land? Henry bought it, Sarah said. Meant to build a home for us there after the war. But when we drifted apart, the deed was left in my name, though I never knew. Dylan found the papers when his mother passed. I think he realized he couldn't legally claim it, so he decided to hide me, push me aside until he could make the land his. Jack's jaw tightened, but Sarah touched his hand again. But that land was never about money. It was meant to be a place for healing, he nodded slowly. Then maybe it still can be. Weeks passed. The snow melted away under the growing warmth of early spring. Wildflowers peeked from the forest's edge, and the sound of construction replaced the eerie silence that had once filled the clearing. Jack had called in favors from old army buddies, and together they laid the first beams of a new cabin, a simple, strong place with wide windows and a porch facing the rising sun. Rex, his sable coat now glossy with good food and care, spent most days trotting between the workers and the woods, a sentinel reborn. The scar along his left hind leg remained, but it didn't slow him. When the hammering stopped for lunch breaks, he'd curl beside Jack's feet, eyes half closed, tail thumping at the sound of Sarah's laughter nearby. She'd recovered remarkably, though her steps were slower now and required a cane carved from pine. But her mind was sharp, and her will even sharper. On the third day of construction, she stood before Jack with a stack of official papers. These were in Dylan's bag, she said. The original inheritance documents, the deed, and something else. Jack flipped through them, land ownership restored in her name, and an unexpected envelope addressed to him. Inside was a letter from a Denver law firm, Henry Whitmore's last legal note, written years after the war. It left Jack the rights to any family holdings in the region and mentioned a name, Sarah Carter. He never stopped wondering, Jack whispered, voice thick. Sarah smiled, eyes moist. He passed that land on for a reason. Maybe we were all meant to meet here. And so they decided. The Whitmore Carter Foundation was born with ink, sweat, and a dream. Registered officially in Jefferson County, it would be a place of retreat for veterans struggling with trauma, and a rescue and rehabilitation center for service dogs, retired, injured, or abandoned. The cabin would be the heart of it, and the forest their shield. Volunteers came, some veterans, some locals, even a young vet tech named Marisol Vega, a petite woman in her late 20s with short black curls and a no-nonsense attitude softened only by her affection for animals. She was the first to move into one of the two new outbuildings, helping design the kennels and train Rex as a therapy dog. Jack watched it all unfold with quiet awe. He still woke sometimes expecting the ceiling to be scorched black, the walls closing in, or Sarah to disappear like a vision. But every morning, the smell of pine, the soft thump of Rex's tail, and Sarah's cane tapping against the porch reminded him it was real. And he belonged here, not as a soldier, but as a builder, a guardian, a grandson. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in strokes of lavender and rose, Jack stood on the porch with a mug of black coffee. Sarah joined him slowly, cane tapping, and leaned on the rail beside him. Rex lay at their feet. "It's quiet," she said, nodded. "Feels like peace," Sarah smiled. "Feels like home." And for the first time in years, Jack believed her. Sometimes, a dog doesn't just bark at danger. It leads you straight into grace. Jack followed a wounded German shepherd into a forgotten cabin and found more than just a woman in need. He found family. He found purpose. He found home. We may not all get chased by fire or haunted by the past, but we all walk through seasons of silence, of loss, of waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, God sends us a whisper through unexpected messengers. A scarred dog, an old letter, a second chance. Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a miracle in fur. And Jack? He was proof that even broken men can build again if they choose to follow where love leads. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Who in your life needs a rescue? What small miracle have you been ignoring? Leave a comment below with your thoughts or a prayer for someone who needs one. Share this video with a friend who believes in quiet heroes. Subscribe for more true-like stories where God works through pause and people. And may the Lord bless you and guide you no matter where your next road begins.